Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're going to take a slow, gentle trip back in time, way back, to ancient Egypt. You'll find yourself waking up by the side of the Great Nile River thousands of years ago. It's okay. You probably won't survive for long without knowing how to build a pyramid or something, but hey, at least we can imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the first hint of light stretching over the flatland. You're waking up, maybe on a simple mat on a packed earth floor, or perhaps in a slightly more elaborate room if you're lucky. The air outside is cool, just before the desert sun starts to really heat things up. Through a small opening, you can hear the soft sounds of the morning. Maybe a donkey braying in the distance, the quiet murmur of voices starting their day. And always, the ever-present gentle lap-lap of the Nile River nearby. It's the heart of everything here, this mighty river. You can almost smell the damp earth right after the yearly flood, mixed with the dust of daily life and maybe the faint, sweet smell of blooming papyrus. You stretch out, feeling the stiffness leave your body after a night's rest. There's no loud alarm clock here, no phone buzzing with emails. The morning call is the sun appearing, the sounds of nature, and the simple rhythm of life that has gone on like this for hundreds, even thousands of years. Your body is probably telling you it's time for something to eat. After a long sleep, you're ready to put some fuel in the tank for the day ahead. In ancient Egypt, the day really began early. People weren't sleeping in until noon. The sun was up and there was work to be done, whether in the fields, in workshops, building temples, or managing a household. So, the first meal of the day, what we might call breakfast, was really important. It wasn't always a huge feast, especially for most people, but it was necessary to give you the energy you needed. Think about it. You're about to face a day under that hot sun doing physical labour. You need something solid to keep you going. As you slowly get up, you might see others in the household doing the same. Preparing the first meal wasn't a complicated affair for most families. There wouldn't be a big, fancy kitchen with lots of different appliances. Life was much simpler. The focus was on practicality, on using what was available from the land blessed by the Nile. The wealthy might have servants to handle everything, but for the vast majority of Egyptians, the morning routine, including getting breakfast ready, was a family or individual task. You might see someone tending to a small fire, getting it ready for baking flatbread or warming something up. The smells would start to drift through the air, perhaps the yeasty scent of baking bread, or something else cooking over the low flames. The materials for your morning meal are likely stored nearby. Grain, the most important part of the Egyptian diet, would be kept in jars or silos, protected as much as possible from pests. Maybe some dried fruit is tucked away, or some vegetables from a small garden patch. Water, fresh from the Nile, though hopefully filtered a bit, is ready for drinking or mixing. It's a picture of resourcefulness, of living directly from the bounty of the river valley. Everything you eat and drink is likely produced very close to where you live. There's no importing coffee from across the world or buying cereal made thousands of miles away. It's local, very local. You step outside, feeling the warmth of the sun starting to increase. The world is waking up around you. Farmers are heading to their fields, craftspeople to their workshops, and traders are getting ready to set up their stalls. Everyone is preparing for the day, and that preparation almost always starts with something in their stomach. It's interesting to think how universal that is, isn't it? No matter where or when you live, that feeling of needing that first bit of food and drink in the morning is the same. Your ancient Egyptian self feels it just as strongly as you do now. What exactly is going to be on your plate? Or more likely, just in your hand or a simple bowl? Well, that's where our journey really begins. The core of the ancient Egyptian diet, the very foundation of their meals, was surprisingly simple, but incredibly effective for providing energy. It wasn't bacon and eggs, or pancakes, or cereal with milk. It was something much more basic, much more fundamental to their way of life. And it was something they consumed not just at breakfast, but at pretty much every meal. It was bread and beer. Yes, beer for breakfast. We'll get into that, don't worry. But for now, just imagine the idea. Starting your day with bread and beer. It sounds perhaps a bit strange to modern ears, but for an ancient Egyptian, it was completely normal, the expected way to break the night's fast. The availability of food, even these simple staples, could change with the seasons, particularly because Egyptian life was so tied to the flooding of the Nile. The annual inundation, as it was called, brought fertile silt to the land, making farming possible. But it also meant periods when the land was flooded, or just after the flood when crops were growing. So the freshness and variety of what was available for your morning meal might depend on the time of year. During the harvest season there would be an abundance of grain, fruits and vegetables. At other times people relied more on stored goods. Dried grain, dried fish, dried fruits. It makes you appreciate the modern convenience of grocery stores, doesn't it? Imagine relying solely on what you could grow, store or trade for locally. The social standing of an ancient Egyptian also played a big role in what their breakfast might look like. A wealthy scribe or a priest might have access to a wider variety of foods, perhaps some meat, milk, honey, or a greater selection of fruits and vegetables. Their bread might be made with finer flour, baked more carefully. Their beer might be a better quality brew. But for the vast majority of farmers, labourers and craftspeople, breakfast was functional. It was about getting calories and nutrients needed for work. Their meal would be much simpler, focusing on the essential bread and beer, maybe with a little something extra if they were lucky. Historians still ponder whether the timing of meals was strictly defined for most people, especially in rural areas. While we know the elite likely had more formal meal times, it's a point of contention among experts if a farmer working in the fields stopped for a designated breakfast hour, or simply ate when they woke up and grabbed something else later if they needed it. It was likely more flexible for ordinary people, dictated by the demands of their work and the rhythms of nature. You probably just ate when you felt hungry and had a moment, maybe grabbing your portion of bread and drinking your beer before heading out, or perhaps taking it with you to eat in the field as the sun rose. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit about their mornings is how they handled personal hygiene before eating. While we have images of pharaohs being bathed and anointed for the average person, hygiene was more basic. Washing hands before a meal was likely a common practice, though perhaps not as thorough as modern standards. They understood that cleanliness was important, especially when handling food. You might simply rinse your hands with water from a nearby pot or channel before reaching for that piece of bread. The feeling of the air changing as the sun climbs higher is a signal. The cool morning is quickly fading, replaced by the inevitable heat of the Egyptian day. This reinforces the need for that morning sustenance. You need to fuel up now, before the real work and the real heat begin. That simple meal isn't just about taste, It's about survival and energy. It's the base upon which the entire day is built. Without it, facing the physical challenges of ancient Egyptian life would be incredibly difficult. It's a reminder that even the most basic aspects of life, like what you eat for breakfast, are deeply connected to the environment, the economy, and the social structure of the time. You're not just eating, you're participating in a timeless ritual of waking up and preparing to live. So, as the sun fully clears the horizon, casting long shadows, you anticipate that first bite of bread, that first sip of beer. It's not a lavish spread, but it is your energy for the day. It connects you to everyone else around you, from the pharaoh in his palace to the farmer by the riverbank. Everyone, in their own way, relies on the same fundamental resources shaped by the same environment. That shared reliance on the simple gifts of the Nile, the grain for bread and beer, the water itself, is a unifying thread through ancient Egyptian society, starting with the very first meal of the day. Okay, so you're awake, the sun's coming up, and your ancient Egyptian stomach is rumbling. What's waiting for you? As we just touched upon, the superstars of the ancient Egyptian breakfast table, and indeed most meals, were bread and beer. Forget your modern ideas of what breakfast should be. In this time and place, these two items weren't just part of the meal, they were the meal for most people. They were the energy bars, the coffee, the cereal, and maybe even a good portion of your daily water intake, all rolled into one simple package. Think of bread as the solid fuel and beer as the liquid fuel, providing necessary calories and hydration for a tough day. Bread was absolutely central to the Egyptian diet. They ate a lot of it. In fact, bread was so important that it was often used as a form of payment. Workers might receive loaves of bread as part of their wages. This mainstream historical fact highlights just how much it was a staple. More than just food, it was currency, a measure of wealth and sustenance. Imagine getting paid in bread instead of money. It really puts its importance into perspective. If you worked for someone, they weren't just paying you, they were literally giving you the means to survive in the form of bread. Now the bread they ate was probably quite different from the fluffy loaf you might buy at the store today. Ancient Egyptian bread was typically made from emmer wheat or barley, grains that grew well along the Nile. The process of making it wasn't as refined as modern methods. The grain was ground using stone tools, which meant that tiny bits of grit and sand often ended up in the flour. When you ate the bread, this grit would gradually wear down your teeth. Archaeological evidence shows that tooth problems were very common in ancient Egypt, and this abrasive bread was a major reason why. So, that morning bite wasn't just providing energy, it was slowly, surely grinding away at your enamel. A rather rough start to the day, wouldn't you say? Like eating a health bar made with gravel. Yum! The bread itself usually came in simple flat loaves or round shapes. It was often quite dense and heavy. Baking happened in simple ovens or even just on hot stones or in pits. Imagine the smell of that fresh bread baking over an open fire as you wake up. It would have been a comforting, familiar aroma throughout any Egyptian village or town. The type and quality of bread could vary. The wealthy might eat bread made with finer flour, perhaps sieved multiple times to remove some of the grit and husk, and maybe even enriched with things like honey or fruit. But for the average person, it was basic, whole grain bread, packed with fibre and whatever unintentional minerals ended up in the flour. Eating this bread in the morning was straightforward. You didn't need knives and forks. You simply broke off a piece with your hands. It was fuel, eaten perhaps quickly before heading out to work, or maybe dipped in water or beer to soften it if it was a bit stale. Since bread was made daily or every few days depending on the household and the amount needed, the morning bread might be freshly baked or a day or two old. Stale bread wouldn't go to waste. It could be soaked and eaten, or even used in brewing the next batch of beer. Nothing was wasted. Now let's talk about the beer. Yes, beer for breakfast. It sounds wild to us, doesn't it? But ancient Egyptian beer wasn't quite like modern beer. It was often thick, cloudy, and had a lower alcohol content. It was more like a nutritious fermented porridge or liquid bread than a crisp lager. It was made from barley or emmer bread that was partially baked, then crumbled and mixed with water and left to ferment. Sometimes dates were added for sweetness and to help the fermentation process. Why drink beer with every meal, including breakfast? Several reasons. First, it was a good source of calories and nutrients from the grain. It was essentially liquid food. Second, and very importantly, brewing involved boiling the water, which made the beer safer to drink than water from the Nile, which could be contaminated. In a world without modern sanitation, drinking beer was often a healthier option than plain water. So, that morning beer wasn't just for getting a buzz, it was a crucial part of staying healthy and getting energy. It was like their morning health shake, but yeasty. It's a point of contention among experts if the alcohol content was always low enough to allow people to work effectively after drinking it at breakfast. Some argue that the fermentation process was controlled to keep the alcohol low, while others suggest that getting a slight buzz might have been common, or that different strengths of beer existed for different times of day or different people. It's likely that for daily consumption, especially before work, the beer was weaker than what might be brewed for a festival or special occasion. Think of it more like a weak, thick cordial than a strong ale. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit about their beer is that it wasn't usually filtered. You would often drink it with a kind of straw, perhaps made from reed, to avoid swallowing the solid bits at the bottom. So, picture yourself in the morning, sipping your thick, yeasty, slightly alcoholic breakfast drink through a straw made of grass. It's a very different image of breakfast beverages than a glass of orange juice or a cup of coffee. Bread and beer were the constants, the reliable foundation of the ancient Egyptian diet, and this started first thing in the morning. For many, this might have been the bulk of their calories for the day, supplemented by other foods when available. It provided the carbohydrates and some protein needed to face the physical demands of their lives. It wasn't a meal of variety or luxury for most, but it was effective. It was the fuel that built pyramids, farmed the land, and kept the civilization running for thousands of years. This simple pairing, bread and beer, consumed as the sun rose, was the quiet engine of ancient Egypt. Now that we've established that bread and beer were the undisputed champions of the ancient Egyptian breakfast, let's think about where those champions came from. They didn't magically appear. The foundation of both bread and beer was grain, specifically barley and emmer wheat. And the reason ancient Egypt could produce enough grain to feed its population, pay its workers, and even export some, was entirely thanks to the Nile River. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the lifeblood of Egypt, turning the narrow strip of land along its banks into incredibly fertile ground, while the vast areas beyond remained mostly barren desert. Imagine living in a place where almost everything you eat comes directly from a narrow green ribbon of land next to a river. That was ancient Egypt. The yearly flooding of the Nile, called the inundation, was everything. It happened predictably, like clockwork, depositing nutrient-rich silt onto the fields after the water receded. This silt was like natural fertilizer, constantly renewing the soil and making it incredibly productive year after year. without the need for modern fertilizers. You didn't have to worry about the soil getting tired. The Nile took care of it. This predictable natural cycle was the basis of Egyptian agriculture, and therefore their entire civilization and their daily meals. The main grains grown were barley and emmer. Emmer wheat was the preferred grain for making bread because it produced a lighter, though still dense by our standards, loaf compared to barley. Barley was very hardy and grew well, making it ideal for brewing beer, though it was also used for bread, especially in poorer households or during times when emmer was less available. These grains were planted after the floodwaters went down in the late autumn. You'd see farmers wading into the still damp, fertile soil, scattering seeds by hand. It was hard work, but essential work. The fate of your family and the whole country depended on a successful harvest. The growing season was relatively short and intense, followed by the harvest in the late spring. As the grains ripened under the hot Egyptian sun, the landscape would change from green fields to golden waves. Harvesting was another labour-intensive process, done by hand using simple sickles. Imagine bending over in the heat, cutting stalk after stalk. Men, women and children would all be involved in this crucial task. The harvested grain was then gathered, tied into bundles, and transported to threshing floors. Threshing was the process of separating the grain kernels from the stalks. This was often done by animals like oxen or donkeys, trampling on the grain spread out on a hard surface, or by using flails. The rhythmic sound of threshing would have been another common part of the Egyptian soundscape during harvest time. After threshing, the grain would be winnowed, which involved tossing it into the air so the wind could blow away the lighter chaff, the husks, leaving the heavier grain kernels to fall back down. It was simple technology, but effective, honed over thousands of years. This harvested grain was then the wealth of Egypt. It was stored in granaries, which could be simple structures in a village or massive state-controlled silos in cities. Protecting the grain from pests like rodents and insects was a constant battle. Losing grain meant hunger, so great care was taken in storage. The stored grain wasn't just food, it was the national reserve, used to feed the population, pay officials and workers, and trade with other regions. This reliance on grain as the primary food source and a form of wealth is a mainstream historical fact that shaped much of Egyptian society and its administration. It's interesting to think about the scale of this agriculture. The Egyptians developed sophisticated irrigation techniques to manage the floodwaters and channel water to fields further from the river during the growing season. They built canals and simple water-lifting devices like the shadoof to make sure their precious crops got enough water. This wasn't just basic farming, it was large-scale, organised agriculture supporting a complex society. The success or failure of the harvest directly impacted the lives of everyone, from the lowest farmer to the highest priest. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that while barley and emmer were dominant, the Egyptians also grew other crops alongside them. They might have small plots of flax for linen, their main material for clothing, and various vegetables and fruits. But the vast fields were dedicated to the grains that provided the bulk of their calories in the form of bread and beer. It's a point of contention among experts if the agricultural techniques used were truly innovative or simply a refinement of very ancient methods passed down through generations. While the irrigation systems show ingenuity, the basic tools and processes for growing and harvesting grain remained relatively unchanged for millennia. Some argue this consistency shows a deep understanding of their environment, while others suggest it reflects a lack of technological advancement compared to other civilizations. Regardless, What they did worked, and it sustained a civilization for an astonishingly long time. So, when you took that bite of ancient Egyptian bread or a sip of their beer in the morning, you were consuming the direct result of this intricate relationship with the Nile. You were eating the sun, the water, and the rich earth, harvested and processed through back-breaking labour. It makes you look at a simple piece of bread a little differently, doesn't it? It was power, sustenance, wealth, and the very essence of Egyptian life. All thanks to those humble grains nurtured by the great river. All right, so we've got the grain, harvested from the fertile banks of the Nile, barley and emmer, full of potential energy. But before that grain could become the essential bread for your ancient Egyptian breakfast, it had to go through a journey. This journey was long, dusty, and required a lot of effort. Turning hard grain kernels into edible bread was a fundamental process done in every Egyptian household or bakery, a skill passed down through generations. The first step after the grain was threshed and winnowed was milling. This meant grinding the grain into flour. For most people, this was a manual process done at home. The tool of choice was a simple stone mill, usually a large flat stone on the bottom, and a smaller rounded stone held in the hands. You would kneel down, place a small amount of grain on the bottom stone, and rub the smaller stone back and forth over it, crushing the kernels into flour. Imagine doing this day after day. It was incredibly hard work, and it was often the job of women in the household. The sound of grinding grain would have been a constant backdrop to daily life. As we mentioned before, because these were stone tools, tiny fragments of grit inevitably broke off the stones and mixed with the flour. No matter how careful you were, some stone dust got in there. This gritty flour was then used to make the bread, contributing to the toothware seen in ancient Egyptian mummies. This fact is a key piece of mainstream historical evidence about their diet and health. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it had a significant impact on their quality of life as they aged. Imagine the discomfort. Once you had your flour, and remember, it was likely a whole grain flour, not refined white flour, you needed to make the dough. The simplest way was to mix the flour with water. Egyptians often used leavening, though. They discovered that using a little bit of old dough or froth from beer production could make the new dough rise. This is an early form of using yeast. So their bread wasn't always completely flat. Some of it had a bit of lightness to it, though still much denser than most modern bread. Mixing was done by hand, kneading the dough until it was ready to be shaped. Dough shaping varied. For the simple, everyday bread eaten at breakfast, it was often formed into flat loaves or round patties. These were easy to bake and easy to carry. More elaborate shapes might be made for offerings or special occasions, sometimes using moulds, but for daily fuel, simple was best. The size and thickness could also vary depending on the intended use and baking method. Baking was the final step. Simple households might bake their bread on hot stones placed over a fire or in a simple temporary oven made from clay. More established bakeries or wealthier homes might have more permanent purpose-built ovens, often made of mud brick. These ovens could be beehive-shaped structures heated from within. Once the oven was hot, the loaves were placed inside to bake. The baking time would depend on the size and thickness of the bread and the heat of the oven. Imagine the scene. Smoke rising from the fire, the heat radiating, and the wonderful smell of baking bread filling the air as morning arrives. It's a smell that would signal that the most important part of the morning meal was almost ready. This daily process of milling and baking was time-consuming and required constant attention. It wasn't something you could just leave to happen. It was an active chore that was part of the daily rhythm of life. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit about their bread making is that sometimes they would add flavourings. While most bread was plain, the wealthy might have bread flavoured with honey, dates, or even spices if available. They also sometimes added fat or milk to the dough to make it richer, though this was not common for everyday bread. So, while the basic loaf was simple, there was potential for variety for those who could afford it. It's a point of contention among experts whether bread making was primarily a household chore, or if bakeries were more common for supplying the general population, especially in larger towns and cities. While we know large institutions like temples and palaces had their own bakeries, the extent to which ordinary people bought bread versus making it themselves is still debated. It likely varied depending on the time period, location, and social status. Maybe you made your own if you lived in a small village, but bought it from a local baker if you were in a city. Regardless of where it was made, the finished bread was the cornerstone of the meal. It was dense, nutritious, and filling. It provided the carbohydrates needed for energy. Eating it in the morning set you up for the physical demands of the day. It might be warm and fresh, or a day or two old and a bit hard, requiring that dip in water or beer. But no matter its state, it was essential. That simple piece of bread in your hand represented hours of labour, from the farmer planting the grain, to the harvesters cutting it, to the women or bakers grinding the flour and baking the loaf. It was a lot of work for one meal, highlighting how precious and vital this staple food was in ancient Egypt. So, you've got your dense, whole grain bread, maybe a little gritty, ready to go for your ancient Egyptian breakfast. And what's the perfect pairing? That thick, yeasty beer we talked about. Now, let's really dive into this fascinating aspect of their diet. Drinking beer wasn't just a luxury or something you did to relax after work. In ancient Egypt, beer was a fundamental part of their nutrition and daily life, consumed by men, women, and even children, though presumably a weaker version for the young ones, with every meal, including that crucial first one in the morning. As we touched on, one of the main reasons for drinking beer was safety. The process of brewing involved heating water, often to boiling or near boiling temperatures, which killed harmful bacteria and parasites that could be present in river water. In a world without modern water purification, this made beer a much safer drink than plain water from the Nile or irrigation channels. So, that morning sip of beer wasn't just refreshing. It was a wise health choice, even if they didn't understand why it prevented illness in the way we do today. It was a practical solution to a very real problem. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Beer was a safe drink option. Beyond safety, Egyptian beer was also nutritious. It was made from fermented grain, barley or emmer. This meant it contained carbohydrates, some protein, and even some vitamins, especially B vitamins produced by the yeast. It was essentially liquid bread, packed with calories needed for energy. For labourers doing hard physical work, beer provided essential sustenance and hydration, more so than plain water alone. Imagine needing to build a pyramid or haul stone all day in the heat. A drink that gives you calories and is safe? That's incredibly valuable. Making beer in ancient Egypt was often done in homes, although larger breweries also existed, especially attached to temples and palaces. The process was similar to making bread. Partially baked bread loaves, usually made specifically for brewing, were crumbled into a vat. Water was added, and sometimes dates were included to provide sugar for fermentation and add flavour. The mixture was left to ferment naturally, relying on wild yeasts in the air and on the ingredients. The process wasn't as controlled as modern brewing, so the resulting beer could vary in strength and flavour. The finished product, as we mentioned, was usually thick and cloudy. It wasn't filtered like most modern beers. You'd often see depictions of people drinking it through straws, presumably to avoid swallowing the solid bits at the bottom of the vessel, bits of grain, yeast sediment, and whatever else settled there. This practice is a quirky, lesser-known tidbit about their beer consumption. Picture that morning ritual, grabbing your bowl or jug of beer and sipping it through a reed straw. It's a very visual and distinct image of ancient Egyptian life. What did it taste like? That's a point of contention among experts. Based on reconstructions and the ingredients, it was likely quite different from modern beer. It was probably less carbonated, less alcoholic, especially the everyday varieties, slightly sweet from the dates if used, and definitely yeasty and grainy. Some compare it to a sour, cloudy, low-alcohol ale, or perhaps a fermented gruel. It wasn't just a refreshing drink, it was a food item you drank. The strength of the beer is another point of discussion. While the daily beer was probably low in alcohol, evidence suggests they could brew stronger versions for festivals and religious ceremonies. It's debated how common it was to drink strong beer, or whether daily consumption led to widespread public intoxication. Most scholars agree that the necessity for workers to be functional likely meant the everyday beer was mild. However, the potential for stronger brews certainly existed. So, your ancient Egyptian breakfast involved picking up that bowl of thick, grainy, slightly alcoholic beer and sipping it through a straw alongside your piece of bread. It provided hydration, crucial calories, some nutrients, and the peace of mind that you weren't drinking potentially contaminated water. It wasn't about relaxation or getting a buzz first thing in the morning. It was about practicality, nutrition, and staying healthy in a challenging environment. Beer was seen as a necessity, a fundamental part of a healthy diet. It was fuel, plain and simple. Imagine the taste and texture. It's probably warm or room temperature, thick on your tongue, with a definite grain flavour and that distinct yeastiness. Maybe a hint of sweetness if dates were added. It's not the crisp, cold, bubbly drink you might be used to. It's something much more earthy, much more tied to the raw ingredients and the simple process of fermentation. It's the taste of ancient Egypt, the taste of survival and daily life. It makes you appreciate the incredible ingenuity of early peoples who figured out how to ferment grains to create both food and a safe drink. That morning beer was a small miracle of ancient technology and necessity. Okay, so while bread and beer were definitely the main characters at the ancient Egyptian breakfast table, they weren't always the only things there. If you were lucky, or if it was the right time of year, or if you had a little garden plot or some extra to trade, you might add some fresh touches to that morning meal. Think of these as the ancient Egyptian equivalents of adding fruit to your yogurt, or a side of toast with jam. They added a bit of flavour, some different textures, and a welcome dose of vitamins to that staple grain diet. One of the most common additions, especially if you lived closer to where they grew, were dates and figs. Egypt was known for these sweet fruits. Date palms grew well in the warmer areas, providing a reliable crop of sugary fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried. Dried dates were particularly useful because they could be stored for a long time, making them available even when fresh fruit wasn't in season. Imagine popping a few sweet, chewy dates alongside your dense bread and beer. It would have been a lovely contrast to the savoury graininess of the main meal. Figs were also popular, offering a different kind of sweetness. These fruits provided quick energy from their natural sugars, which would have been a nice boost first thing in the morning. They weren't just tasty, they were practical sources of fuel. Beyond fruits, vegetables also played a role, though perhaps less central to the breakfast than other meals. Egyptians grew a variety of vegetables in their gardens or in the fields after the main grain harvest. Onions and garlic were very common, used for flavour and their believed health benefits. You might munch on a raw onion or garlic clove with your bread, maybe not the best for morning breath, but definitely a jolt of flavour and some good nutrients. Other vegetables like lettuce, cucumbers, leeks, and types of beans and peas were also grown. If your family had a successful small garden, you might add a cucumber or a handful of fresh peas to the morning spread. It was a way to add freshness and variety to an otherwise very starch-heavy meal. Having access to these fresh items depended heavily on the season and your personal circumstances. Right after the harvest seasons for fruits and vegetables, they would be more readily available and cheaper. At other times of the year, you'd rely on dried fruits like dates or whatever root vegetables stored well. For most ordinary Egyptians, these fresh additions were probably occasional treats, rather than everyday items on the breakfast table. They supplemented the core meal, providing extra vitamins and making the meal a bit more interesting, but they weren't the main source of calories. A mainstream historical fact is that Egyptians had a surprisingly wide variety of cultivated plants, beyond just grains. They were skilled gardeners and farmers, making the most of the fertile land provided by the Nile. Reliefs and tomb paintings show detailed depictions of gardens with various fruits, vegetables, and herbs being grown. This shows that fresh produce was valued and actively cultivated, even if not everyone ate a large amount of it every day. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that they might sometimes mix mashed dates or other fruits into their bread dough before baking, especially for sweeter breads or treats. So, instead of just eating the fruit on the side, it could become an ingredient in the bread itself, adding moisture and sweetness. Imagine a date-infused loaf for breakfast. That sounds quite good, actually. A little prehistoric fruit bread to go with your ancient health drink, beer. It's a point of contention among experts if vegetables were commonly eaten raw with breakfast, or if they were usually cooked in stews or other dishes consumed later in the day. While we know things like onions and lettuce could be eaten raw, the extent to which this was a typical breakfast practice for the average person is debated. It might have been more common to eat cooked vegetable dishes during the main meal later in the day, with breakfast focusing almost entirely on quick, portable energy sources like bread and beer. Perhaps you'd grab a leek to gnaw on as you walk to the field. It's hard to know for sure what was most typical. So, as you sit there with your bread and beer, maybe, just maybe, there's a small pile of dates nearby, or a cucumber you can slice with a simple stone knife. These additions, while perhaps not as filling as the grain staples, provided important micronutrients and made the meal more palatable and varied. They were a little touch of natural sweetness or freshness in a diet dominated by fermented grains. Think of the satisfaction of biting into a sweet date after a mouthful of dense bread. A small moment of simple pleasure in a life that could be quite hard. It wasn't a fruit salad. Definitely not. More like a fruit suggestion, or a vegetable hint. But every little bit of variety helped make that crucial first meal of the day not just necessary fuel, but also a little bit more enjoyable. They were like the sprinkles on top of the ancient Egyptian breakfast, if the sprinkles were dates and onions. A very unique combination, I know. These simple garden goods represent another layer of resourcefulness and connection to the land. You weren't just eating grain, you were eating what your small patch of earth, nurtured by the Nile, could provide. It reinforces the idea that ancient Egyptian life was deeply intertwined with its environment and the cycles of nature. Every date, every fig, every onion was a gift from that fertile valley, adding a touch of life to the fundamental diet of bread and beer. Imagine the farmer who grew these things, or the person who tended a small household garden. They put in the effort, and in return they got to add these fresh elements to their meals. It was a direct reward for labour, a visible sign of the bounty the land could offer beyond the essential grains. And in the morning, as the sun rose, reaching for a handful of dates or a crisp cucumber would have felt like a little luxury, even if it was just something grown right outside your door. It wasn't a guaranteed part of everyone's breakfast, but when it was there, it made a difference. A small difference, perhaps, but one that added flavour, nutrition, and a touch of simple sweetness or crunch to start the day. It's a picture of a diet that was incredibly practical and based on necessity, but with room for small moments of simple enjoyment provided by nature's bounty. Moving on from the sweet dates and crunchy cucumbers, let's look at another important group of foods that could show up at the ancient Egyptian breakfast table, adding some much-needed protein to the mix: beans and lentils. While grain provided the bulk of the calories in the form of carbohydrates, legumes offered a valuable source of protein and fibre, essential for sustained energy, especially for those facing a day of heavy physical labour. These humble plants were grown widely in Egypt. Fava beans, sometimes called broad beans, were particularly important and common. Lentils were also cultivated. These legumes were relatively easy to grow after the main grain harvest, using the residual moisture from the Nile flood or relying on irrigation. They were a way to get more food from the land, providing a different kind of nutrient profile than the cereal grains. Preparing beans and lentils usually involved drying them for storage, as fresh legumes are only available for a short season. Dried beans and lentils needed to be soaked for a long time, often overnight, and then boiled until soft. This boiling process would have been done over a simple fire, perhaps in a clay pot. The resulting dish would have been a thick, hearty mash, or stew of beans or lentils. Imagine a bowl of slow-cooked fava beans or lentils as part of your morning meal. It sounds like a filling, substantial start to the day, doesn't it? For many, especially those working manual jobs like farming or construction, this bowl of cooked legumes would have been a vital energy source. It provided the protein that bread and beer, while caloric, didn't offer in huge amounts. Eating beans or lentils for breakfast meant you'd feel full for longer and have the sustained energy needed for physical exertion under the hot sun. It was practical food designed to power the body through demanding work. A mainstream historical fact is that legumes like fava beans were a significant part of the diet for ordinary Egyptians, providing essential protein. They are depicted in tomb paintings and mentioned in texts as common food items. This highlights their importance as a dietary staple alongside grain, especially for people who didn't regularly eat meat. They were the protein powerhouse for the masses. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that there's evidence that Egyptians sometimes flavoured their cooked beans and lentils with herbs and spices, like coriander or cumin, if they had access to them. They might also add onions or garlic for extra flavour. So, it wasn't always just plain boiled beans. They made them as tasty as their limited resources allowed. Imagine a flavourful herby bean stew for breakfast. It sounds a bit more appealing than plain mush, doesn't it? Though, given the context of the time, tasty might have had a different standard. Perhaps less bland is more accurate. It's a point of contention among experts if legumes were a standard daily breakfast item for most people, or if they were more commonly eaten at other meals, or reserved for certain times of the year. While we know they were important in the diet, the frequency and timing of their consumption, specifically at breakfast, isn't as clearly documented as the centrality of bread and beer. They might have been more common when other foods were scarce, or perhaps eaten on days with particularly heavy work planned. It's hard to say definitively whether you'd expect a bowl of beans every morning. Maybe some days you just had bread and beer, and other days you got the bonus beans. It probably depended on your household supplies and wealth. So picture yourself in the morning, perhaps spooning a thick, earthy bean mash from a simple clay bowl. It's warm, filling, and provides a different kind of satisfaction than just bread. It's the kind of food that sticks with you, giving you the strength to lift heavy stones, swing a sickle in the field, or spend hours grinding grain. It wasn't glamorous food, not like something you'd see in a pharaoh's feast, but it was effective. It was the working person's protein boost, essential fuel for the engine of ancient Egypt. Eating beans and lentils also ties back to the resourcefulness of the Egyptians. They utilised the land to grow a variety of crops, ensuring they had different sources of nutrients. Legumes were a relatively cheap and efficient way to get protein compared to raising animals for meat, which required more land and resources. So, relying on beans and lentils made economic and agricultural sense for a large population. It was smart farming leading to practical eating. Perhaps the only downside from a modern perspective might be the digestive effects of a bean-heavy breakfast. Ancient Egyptians probably didn't have modern remedies for, shall we say, the consequences of eating a lot of boiled legumes. So, maybe that morning stroll to the fields wasn't always the most comfortable experience. Just a little something to ponder as you imagine that hearty bowl of beans. Provides protein, yes, but also provides musical accompaniment? Probably. Overall, while bread and beer were non-negotiable, having beans or lentils at breakfast was a valuable addition for many. It transformed the meal from simply providing basic calories into a more balanced source of energy, giving you the staying power needed to face the day's demands. It was a simple dish, born out of necessity and the bounty of the land, but it played a crucial role in fueling the people who built one of the world's most enduring civilizations, a quiet champion of the ancient Egyptian breakfast table, perhaps not as famous as bread or beer, but just as important for keeping things running. Okay, we've talked about the absolute essentials, bread and beer, and the helpful additions like fruits, vegetables, beans and lentils. Now, let's add a touch of sweetness and richness to the picture. While not as common as bread and beer for the average person's breakfast, honey and dairy products were available in ancient Egypt, offering different flavours and nutrients, particularly for those who were wealthier or involved in animal husbandry or beekeeping. Honey was the primary sweetener in ancient Egypt. Sugar from sugarcane didn't exist there at this time, so honey was the main way to add sweetness to food and drinks, and it was also used as a medicine. Egyptians kept bees, cultivating them for their valuable honey and beeswax. Beekeeping is depicted in tomb paintings, showing that it was an organised activity. Honey was highly valued. It wasn't something everyone could afford to use freely. If you had honey on your breakfast table, even just a little bit, you were doing pretty well. Imagine dipping a piece of your bread into some golden honey, a truly luxurious way to start the day by ancient Egyptian standards. A mainstream historical fact is the importance of honey not just as food, but also for medicinal purposes and in religious offerings. Its value meant it was often kept in sealed jars and carefully accounted for. For breakfast, a bit of honey could be added to bread dough, used as a dip or perhaps mixed into milk if milk was available. It provided quick energy from its sugars and made less palatable food more enjoyable. Dairy products came mainly from cows, but also goats and sheep. Milk was consumed, though probably not as widely as beer, partly because it doesn't stay fresh for long in a warm climate without refrigeration. It might have been more accessible to people who owned livestock or lived near those who did. Fresh milk in the morning would have been a treat. They also made simple forms of cheese and a type of yogurt or soured milk. These fermented dairy products would last longer than fresh milk and provided protein and fat. A dollop of ancient Egyptian yogurt or a bit of simple cheese alongside your bread would have added richness and different nutrients. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that some depictions show Egyptians using ring-shaped bread, which they might have dipped into liquids like honey or milk. So, the ancient equivalent of dipping a donut or bagel. Maybe not quite, but the idea of a bread shape designed for dipping into something sweet or rich seems to fit the occasional use of honey or dairy with bread at breakfast. It's a point of contention among experts how common dairy consumption, especially milk, was for adults. While children might have drunk milk regularly, lactose intolerance was likely common in the ancient world, just as it is today. This might have limited milk consumption among adults, making fermented products like cheese and yogurt more popular if dairy was eaten at all. So, while milk was available, it's debated whether your average adult Egyptian was regularly drinking a glass of it with breakfast. Perhaps it was more commonly used in cooking, or primarily consumed by the very young or very wealthy. For most ordinary people, honey and dairy were likely not part of the daily breakfast. They were expensive or perishable, making them occasional treats or foods primarily for the elite. If you were a farmer with a cow, you might have milk or simple cheese. If you were a beekeeper, you'd have honey. Otherwise, you'd probably only encounter these if you were wealthy, or receive them as part of a special event or payment. Imagine the contrast. While most people started their day with gritty bread and thick beer, a wealthier person might have finer bread, maybe sweetened with honey, and a bowl of fresh milk or tangy yogurt. These additions weren't just about taste. They represented status and access to different resources. Honey required skill in beekeeping and protection from theft, while dairy required owning and caring for livestock. So, while you're imagining your ancient Egyptian self, remember that your breakfast likely didn't feature a sweet drizzle of honey or a creamy side of yogurt unless your family was well off or had a specific connection to these resources. But the possibility of these foods being part of an Egyptian breakfast, even if only for a few, adds another layer to the picture of their diet. It shows that when resources allowed, they did enjoy sweetness and richness, using what nature provided, the diligent work of bees and the milk from their animals. Starting the day with a taste of honey would have been like a small burst of sunshine, a natural energy shot. Having milk or cheese would add a different kind of substance to the meal. These weren't the fuel that built the pyramids, but they were the touches that made life a little bit sweeter or richer for those who could access them. They represent the upper end of the breakfast possibilities for the time, showing that while the basics were universal, there was also room for variety and even luxury in the ancient Egyptian morning meal. Just don't expect pancakes with syrup. Ancient Egypt was more about dipping bread into honey like a boss. Alright, so we've painted a pretty clear picture of the basic ancient Egyptian breakfast. Bread and beer, maybe some simple additions like dates or beans if you were lucky. But what if you weren't an ordinary farmer or labourer? What if you were, say, A scribe in the pharaoh's court, a high priest, or even royalty yourself? Well, your morning meal would look quite a bit different. Forget gritty bread and simple beer, you're entering the realm of ancient Egyptian luxury breakfast. Life for the elite was, predictably, much more comfortable and varied than for the common people. This extended directly to their diet. They had access to a wider range of foods, prepared with more care and skill by servants and specialized cooks. Their breakfast wasn't just about basic sustenance, it could be a display of wealth and status. Imagine waking up in a large, well-decorated house, perhaps with its own private garden. Servants are already at work. Instead of simple, gritty bread, you might be served bread made from finely sifted flour, perhaps enriched with honey, milk or butter, clarified fat. It might be baked in more elaborate shapes or flavoured with spices. This finer bread would have been much softer and less abrasive than the common variety, a direct result of using better ingredients and more refined processes. Their beer was also likely of higher quality, made from the best grains, brewed carefully, perhaps filtered, though still potentially cloudy by modern standards, and possibly flavoured with dates or other fruits to make it sweeter and more palatable. They might have different types or strengths of beer available, chosen depending on the occasion or personal preference. So your morning drink isn't just functional fuel, it's a beverage to be enjoyed. Beyond the upgraded staples, the elite's breakfast could include foods rarely seen by the common person. Meat, for example, was expensive and not a daily food for most Egyptians, but the elite could afford it. While perhaps more common at the main meal later in the day, leftover roasted meat from an evening feast like duck, goose or beef might be available in the morning. Fish from the Nile, a staple for many, might also be prepared more elaborately. Dairy products like milk, cheese and yogurt were more readily available to the wealthy. As we just discussed, a bowl of fresh milk or some tangy yogurt, perhaps sweetened with expensive honey, could be part of their breakfast spread. Fresh fruits and vegetables, including those that might be harder to cultivate or had to be acquired through trade, would be available year-round, thanks to their wealth and ability to store or acquire them. They might have access to pomegranates, grapes, fresh and dried into raisins, and a wider variety of garden produce than the average person. A mainstream historical fact is that the diet of the ancient Egyptian elite was significantly richer and more varied than that of the common population. This is clear from examining tomb contents, which included provisions for the afterlife mirroring their earthly wealth, and from depictions in tomb paintings and texts describing banquets and daily meals in wealthy households. They literally took their fancy food with them. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit about the elite is that they might have had access to more exotic food items acquired through trade or as tribute from other lands. While not necessarily a breakfast item, the fact they consumed things like imported olive oil, foreign wines, or rare spices highlights their ability to go far beyond the local fare that sustained the masses. Their breakfast spread could, potentially, hint at these wider connections, maybe a sprinkle of an expensive spice on their bread, or a fruit not commonly grown in Egypt. It's a point of contention among experts exactly how much meat was consumed daily by the elite, even at breakfast. While we know they ate meat, whether it was a standard part of the first meal every single day, or more for lunches and dinners or special occasions, is debated. Depictions often show large feasts, but everyday reality might have been slightly less extravagant, even for the rich. So, maybe that leftover roast duck was a frequent luxury, but perhaps not a guaranteed morning fixture. Imagine the scene. You're the wealthy official sitting on a comfortable chair, not kneeling by a grinding stone. Your breakfast is brought to you. Finely baked bread, perhaps still warm from the oven. A bowl of smooth, perhaps fruit-flavoured beer or a refreshing cup of milk. A plate with fresh dates, figs and grapes. Maybe even a little dish of honey for dipping, or some soft cheese. It's a world away from the simple, rough meal of the farmer. It wasn't just food, it was comfort, status, and variety. This contrast in breakfast highlights the significant social stratification in ancient Egypt. Your place in society dictated not just your home or your job, but the very food you ate, starting with the first meal of the day. The pharaoh and his court ate a diet that was not only more abundant, but also qualitatively different, less gritty, more refined, and more varied. While the common person ate to fuel labour, the elite ate for sustenance, pleasure, and as a reflection of their high status. Think about the sheer amount of labour involved in producing an elite breakfast. Growing specialised fruits, keeping livestock for milk and meat, managing bees for honey, employing servants to mill flour finely and bake delicate bread. It all depended on controlling resources and commanding labour, resources that were ultimately generated by the hard work of the common people whose own breakfasts were much simpler. It's a powerful reminder that even something as basic as breakfast can tell us a lot about the structure and inequalities of an ancient society. Their breakfast wasn't just better, it represented a whole different level of existence. Okay, let's bring it back down to earth, or rather back to the fields and workshops along the Nile. We've peeked into the luxurious breakfast world of the elite, but for the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, the morning meal was dictated by practicality, necessity, and the simple goal of getting enough energy to work. This was the worker's fuel, simple, strong, and effective. For the average farmer, labourer, craftsperson, or servant, breakfast was primarily about sustenance. There wasn't time or resources for elaborate spreads or gourmet items. The priority was getting calories and basic nutrients into your body efficiently, so you could start your physically demanding day. Their breakfast was a direct reflection of their life, hard-working, resource-dependent, and focused on the essentials. As we've established, the core of this meal was, without question, bread and beer. You woke up, grabbed your portion of the daily bread ration, likely that dense, whole-grain loaf, maybe a bit gritty, and a measure of thick, nutritious beer. This combination provided the bulk of the calories needed to perform manual labour in the heat. The carbohydrates from the bread gave quick energy, and the calories and hydration from the beer kept you going. It was the ancient equivalent of a working person's meal replacement shake and energy bar, all in one simple package. This reliance on bread and beer as the primary fuel source for workers is a well-documented mainstream historical fact. It's recorded in texts describing rations given to labourers, tomb paintings showing people eating these staples, and archaeological finds of bread and beer remains. It wasn't just a food, it was the foundation of their diet, and the energy source that built the Egyptian economy and its monumental structures. While bread and beer were the mainstays, you might have had a little something extra depending on what was available and affordable. Perhaps a few dates if they were in season, or you could trade for them. Maybe a small portion of boiled beans or lentils for added protein, if your household grew them or could acquire them. But these additions were likely supplements to the main event, not the focus of the meal. You weren't sitting down to a varied plate. You were fueling up on grain products. Imagine eating your breakfast quickly before heading out to the fields as the sun is just starting to warm the air, You might eat standing up or squatting for a moment, breaking off pieces of bread and washing them down with gulps of beer. It wasn't a leisurely breakfast. It was functional. Get the fuel in, get to work. The pace of life, dictated by the sun and the demands of labour, meant breakfast was often a quick affair. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the way these rations were often distributed. Workers on large projects like pyramid building or quarrying were often paid in food, primarily bread and beer, along with other goods. This system of payment meant that your breakfast wasn't just your meal, it was your wage, earned through yesterday's labour, and needed for today's work. It creates a very direct link between your effort and your immediate sustenance. Imagine getting your breakfast delivered as your paycheck. Gives eating your wages a whole new meaning. It's a point of contention among experts how much dietary variation there was within the working class. While the elite diet was clearly different, it's debated whether different types of labourers, e.g. farmers versus craftsmen versus quarry workers, received slightly different rations or had access to different supplemental foods based on the nature or intensity of their work. Were quarry workers given extra beans for more protein? Did farmers eat more seasonal vegetables from their own plots? The extent of these potential variations for ordinary people is still discussed based on the available evidence. The tools for eating breakfast were minimal for workers. No fancy plates or cutlery. You might have a simple clay bowl or jug for your beer and perhaps a mat or cloth to place your bread on, or just hold it in your hand. Eating was done directly, using your hands to break and lift the food. This simplicity in tools reflects the practicality of the meal. It wasn't about presentation, it was about consumption. This worker's breakfast wasn't glamorous, but it was incredibly effective. It provided the necessary calories and energy for a civilization built on manual labour. It was the constant, reliable meal that powered the building of temples, the harvesting of crops, and the countless other tasks that kept Egyptian society functioning. It was food as fuel, pure and simple. Thinking about this basic, energy-focused meal gives you a real appreciation for the connection between diet, work, and survival in the ancient world. Your morning meal wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It was a direct input needed to generate the output of labour. Without that bread and beer, the work simply couldn't get done. It was the most fundamental part of the daily cycle, the necessary beginning to another day of building, farming, and living under the Egyptian sun. It wasn't fancy, but it worked, and it sustained millions of people for thousands of years. That's pretty impressive for some bread and beer, wouldn't you say? Just chew carefully to avoid the grit. So, you've got your bread, maybe some beer, perhaps a date or two, ready for that first meal of the day. But how was all this stuff made, and how did you actually eat it? Let's think about the kitchen life and the tools involved in preparing and eating your ancient Egyptian breakfast. It wasn't like today with cupboards full of gadgets and appliances. Life was much simpler, relying on basic tools and manual labour. For most households, the kitchen wasn't a dedicated room with countertops and sinks. It was often an outdoor area or a corner of a room with a hearth or a place to build a fire. Cooking and baking required fire, so doing it outside or in a well-ventilated space made sense. Imagine the smell of wood smoke mingling with the morning air, the warmth of the fire as you prepare the meal. The most essential tool related to breakfast was the stone quern for grinding grain. We talked about the grit it added to the bread. This tool, typically a saddle quern, looked like a large, slightly curved stone base, the saddle, and a smaller loaf-shaped stone you held and rubbed back and forth. The process of grinding grain was incredibly labour-intensive. requiring physical strength and hours of work each day. Imagine the repetitive motion, the dust, the noise of stone scraping on stone. This wasn't a quick whiz in a food processor. It was a serious workout. The fact that this manual grinding with stone querns was the primary method for producing flour for millennia is a significant mainstream historical fact about ancient diets and technology. It shows both ingenuity in creating effective tools from natural materials and the sheer amount of human effort required for basic food preparation. Once the flour was ground, and hopefully you got most of the tiny stone bits out, though some always remained, you needed to mix the dough. This was done in simple bowls, likely made of clay or perhaps wood for the wealthy. Your hands were the primary mixing tools, kneading the flour and water and perhaps leaven or other additions together. There weren't electric mixers or dough hooks, just your own two hands feeling the texture of the dough, working it until it was ready. Baking the bread involved fire. Simple methods included placing the dough directly on hot stones or on the floor of a heated pit. More advanced techniques used clay ovens, which could be simple structures built outdoors. These ovens were heated by building a fire inside, letting it burn down to embers, and then placing the dough inside to bake. The type of oven or baking surface used affected the shape and texture of the finished bread. Using hot stones often resulted in flatbreads, while ovens could produce thicker loaves. Imagine carefully placing your precious dough into the hot oven or onto the stones, hoping it would bake correctly. It required skill and practice to get it just right. For preparing other breakfast items, simple clay pots were used for boiling things like beans or lentils. You'd put the soaked legumes and water into the pot and place it directly in the embers or over a low fire. There weren't stovetops with temperature controls. You managed the heat by adjusting the fire. Imagine the gentle bubbling of a bean pot as the sun comes up, the earthy smell mixing with the scent of baking bread. When it came to eating the meal, things were also very basic. For most people, plates and cutlery as we know them didn't exist for everyday meals. You might eat your bread directly from your hand, breaking off pieces. For things like cooked beans or perhaps a bit of stew, you might use a simple clay bowl. Spoons weren't common. You'd likely scoop the food with your hand or a piece of bread. And then there was the beer, served in jars, jugs, or bowls. As we mentioned, a quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that Egyptians often drank their thick, unfiltered beer through straws. These weren't plastic straws like today. They were likely made from hollow reeds or metal tubes for the wealthy. This straw helped them avoid swallowing the solid bits of grain and yeast that settled at the bottom of the drinking vessel. So, your breakfast setup might involve a bowl of beer and a reed straw. Quite a different image from a coffee mug. It's a point of contention among experts exactly how standardized these tools and methods were across Egypt. While the basic principles were the same, the quality of materials, the design of ovens, and the types of vessels likely varied depending on region, time period, and the wealth of the household or institution. Was every saddle quern the same? Were all clay pots made the same way? Probably not, leading to variations in efficiency and the final product. Imagine the state of things after the meal. No dishwasher. Cleaning up would involve scraping out pots and bowls and rinsing them with water, likely from the Nile. Hygiene was important, but the tools available for cleaning were basic. You probably didn't get things sparkling clean in the way we expect today. From milling the grain to eating the final product, the ancient Egyptian breakfast involved a direct, hands-on relationship with your food and the tools used to prepare it. It required labour, skill, and a deep understanding of simple materials: stone, clay, fire. The absence of complex machinery meant that food preparation was a significant part of daily life, not a quick task done with push buttons and timers. That simple piece of bread in your hand represented not just the farmer's labour, but also the miller's strength, the baker's skill, and a direct connection to the earth and fire. It makes you appreciate the convenience of modern life, doesn't it? Imagine grinding all the flour for your family's bread by hand every few days. You'd definitely earn your breakfast. The tools were simple, yes, but they were effective. They were developed and refined over thousands of years, perfectly suited to the available materials and the needs of the population. They allowed the Egyptians to process their staple crops into the food that sustained their civilization. And in the quiet morning light, these simple tools, the grinding stones, the clay bowls, perhaps that reed straw, were the humble instruments of the most important meal of the day. They were the ancient Egyptian version of your toaster, your cereal bowl, and your coffee maker, all rolled into a much more physically demanding experience. But hey, at least you got a workout before breakfast was even ready. Okay, so you know what they ate and how it was made using simple tools. Now, let's think about the setting. When and where did this ancient Egyptian breakfast actually happen? Forget the idea of a formal dining room or even a kitchen table for most people. The timing and location of the first meal were closely tied to the rhythm of ancient Egyptian life. The rising sun, the demands of work, and the flow of the Great Nile. For the vast majority of working people, breakfast happened early. The sun was their alarm clock. As the first light appeared over the horizon, people were waking up and getting ready to start their tasks, whether that was heading to the fields, opening a workshop, or beginning domestic chores. The meal needed to be consumed relatively quickly to allow them to get to work as the day began to warm up. There wasn't a concept of a leisurely breakfast hour like some people might enjoy today. It was about fueling up for the demands ahead. The location of the meal was often informal. For a farming family, it might be eaten outside their simple mud brick home, maybe near the outdoor hearth where the bread was baked. You might squat down or sit on the ground. If you were heading out to the fields, you might even take your portion of bread and your beer with you to eat as you walked, or just after arriving at your workplace, as the sun was fully rising. Imagine eating your breakfast as you watch the light spread across the fertile land, the sounds of the waking world around you. For workers on large projects like those building temples or working in quarries, rations of bread and beer would be distributed at the start of the working day. You'd eat your fill alongside your fellow labourers, perhaps sitting in a designated area near the work site. It was a communal meal in that sense, shared with your workmates, all fueling up for the day's heavy tasks. This communal aspect of meal distribution for workers is a mainstream historical fact, providing a sense of shared experience and identity among labourers. For the elite, the setting was, of course, more comfortable and potentially more formal. They might eat in a courtyard, a shaded portico, or even a room within their large house. While not necessarily a formal dining room as we picture it, there might be designated areas for eating, perhaps with low tables or comfortable seating. Their meal wouldn't be rushed. Servants would prepare and serve the food, allowing for a more relaxed start to the day. The social context of breakfast varied. For most families, it was likely a household affair, with everyone grabbing their portion and eating together before scattering for the day's work. For labourers on large projects, it was a meal shared with their work gang, strengthening bonds among them. For the elite, it might be eaten with immediate family or even alone, served by staff. So, who you ate with was another reflection of your place in ancient Egyptian society. It's a point of contention among experts exactly how many meals the average ancient Egyptian ate throughout the day, and precisely when. While we know a substantial first meal, breakfast was important, and there was likely a main meal later in the day, perhaps in the late afternoon or evening. Whether there was a distinct midday meal, lunch, for everyone is debated. For workers in the fields, they might simply snack on some dried dates, or a piece of leftover bread during the hottest part of the day, rather than stopping for a formal second meal. The timing was likely flexible and dictated by the demands of labour and the availability of food. Did you get a lunch break? Maybe. Maybe not. It probably depended on your boss. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that tomb paintings sometimes show offerings of food, including bread and beer, being presented to the deceased at various times, implying a continuation of daily meal rituals in the afterlife. This suggests that the rhythm of meals, including the morning one, was seen as fundamental to existence, something you'd continue even after death. So, picture yourself in the morning light. The air is still relatively cool, but you can feel the sun's warmth building. The sounds of the village or work camp are starting up. You grab your simple food, maybe a piece of bread, a bowl of beer, perhaps some beans. You eat quickly, maybe outside, maybe with your family or fellow workers. There's no coffee to slowly sip, no newspaper to read. Your focus is on getting the necessary fuel into your body so you can face the day ahead. This simple act of eating breakfast, happening across Egypt thousands of years ago, was a universal experience, tying everyone together in the daily cycle of life, work, and reliance on the land. Whether you were a farmer eating in your field, a builder eating in the shadow of a rising wall, or a priest eating in a temple courtyard, that first meal was your personal preparation for the day. It wasn't always comfortable or leisurely, but it was essential. It was the moment the body was refueled and ready to take on whatever challenges the Egyptian day brought. And it all happened as the sun began its journey across the sky, just like it does today, a timeless ritual connecting you across the millennia. Okay, we've covered the usual suspects at the ancient Egyptian breakfast table: bread, beer, maybe dates, beans, or if you were fancy, honey and dairy. But what about the things you might not expect? Were there any surprising or less common foods that could make an appearance when the sun came up? Yes, sometimes, depending on location, season, and opportunity. The Egyptian breakfast could include a few unexpected morsels. One significant food source for Egyptians was the Nile itself. Fish were abundant in the river and its canals. For people living near the water, fish would have been a common part of the diet. While often eaten cooked in stews or grilled, dried and salted fish was also common, as it could be stored. It's possible that leftover dried fish from the previous day could be eaten as part of the morning meal, perhaps alongside the standard bread. Imagine gnawing on a piece of tough salty fish for breakfast. Definitely a different flavour profile than a sweet pastry. This use of dried fish as a staple food source, particularly for protein, is a mainstream historical fact for many coastal and riverine communities in the ancient world, including parts of Egypt. Birds were also a source of food. Egyptians kept ducks and geese, and wild birds were hunted. Roasted duck or goose might be available, particularly for the wealthy. Could leftovers from an evening feast make their way to the breakfast table? Probably for the elite. So, while not an everyday item for most, a wealthy Egyptian might occasionally have cold roasted fowl as part of their morning spread. Eggs are another food that raises questions. Chickens weren't common in Egypt until later periods. But Egyptians did keep ducks and geese. Did they eat the eggs? Likely, yes. However, evidence for regular egg consumption, especially at breakfast, is less clear than for bread, beer, or even fish. It's a point of contention among experts whether eggs were a frequent part of the diet for the average person, or more of a seasonal or occasional food. Were they eaten for breakfast? We don't have definitive proof it was a standard practice, but it's certainly possible, especially for those who raised birds. Imagine a simple boiled duck egg with your bread, a good protein boost. What about spices and herbs? While most everyday food was likely plain, some flavourings were available. Coriander, cumin, fenugreek, and mint were known and used. Could a farmer sprinkle a few mint leaves on their beans? Could the elite spice their bread dough? Yes, if they had access and could afford them. These would add a bit of zing to an otherwise potentially monotonous diet. Using local herbs for flavour is a simple, widespread practice across cultures. Garlic and onions, as we mentioned, were common vegetables, often eaten raw. While perhaps not a surprising food, the sheer amount of raw onion or garlic some people might have eaten with their morning bread could be surprising from a modern perspective. Pungent. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is the consumption of lotus seeds and roots. The lotus plant grew in the Nile and provided edible parts. The seeds could be dried and ground into flour or eaten whole, and the roots were also edible. These were wild resources that people could gather, offering another supplemental food source. Could you have nibbled on dried lotus seeds with your breakfast? It's possible, adding a less common plant food to the mix. Some depictions show Egyptians consuming various parts of plants we might not consider food today. While not strictly breakfast items, the willingness to use diverse natural resources highlights their adaptability. Think about things like papyrus roots, though perhaps more as a famine food, or other wild plants gathered from the marshes. While unlikely to be a regular part of breakfast, these could occasionally supplement the diet. So, while the core of the ancient Egyptian breakfast was incredibly consistent, bread and beer, there was potential for variation, especially if you were open to eating things caught from the river, raised on your small holding, or gathered from the wild. Fish, fowl, maybe even an egg, flavoured with a local herb, alongside your staples. These weren't the guaranteed items, but they show that the picture wasn't entirely monochrome. There were splashes of other flavours and textures, offering small moments of dietary departure from the everyday norm. It adds a layer of complexity to the simple meal, reminding us that ancient people were resourceful and ate what was available to them, even if it seems a bit unusual to us today. Breakfasting on dried fish or a raw onion might not be your ideal start, but for an ancient Egyptian, it could be a valuable part of their morning fuel. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the solid food at the ancient Egyptian breakfast, the bread, the beans, the occasional fish, but let's not forget the liquids. Staying hydrated was crucial in the hot Egyptian climate, and while beer was a key drink, it wasn't the only liquid available at dawn. What else might you have had to quench your thirst or wash down that hearty bread? Water was, of course, the most fundamental drink. The Nile River was the primary source of water for everything: farming, washing, drinking. However, as we discussed when talking about beer, Nile water wasn't always safe to drink directly. It could carry silt, bacteria, and parasites. So, while water was essential, drinking it safely was a challenge. Egyptians did develop methods to try and purify water, though not to modern standards. They might let water sit in jars so the silt would settle to the bottom. Some reliefs seem to depict filtering devices, perhaps made of cloth. Boiling water was another way to make it safer, which is why beer brewing was so beneficial from a health perspective. It's a point of contention among experts exactly how common or effective these water purification methods were for the general population, and how often people risk drinking untreated or minimally treated water. It's likely that many people did drink Nile water directly, especially in rural areas, and suffered the health consequences. So while water was available, it might not have been the preferred or safest morning drink compared to beer. However, if you were very poor, or if beer wasn't available, you would have drunk water. Imagine the simple act of dipping a jug into the Nile or a well and drinking, knowing there was a risk involved. It makes that slightly strange sounding beer for breakfast seem much more appealing. Beyond water and beer, other drinks were less common for a typical breakfast, especially for ordinary people. Wine, made from grapes, which were grown in Egypt, was a drink of the elite and used for festivals and religious purposes. It was expensive and not something the average worker would drink regularly, let alone for breakfast. So starting your day with a glass of wine was definitely not a standard practice. That was reserved for wealthier tables or special occasions. Fruit juices were also possible, particularly date juice or grape juice. Dates were abundant and pressing them could produce a sweet liquid. Grape juice was also made, and it could also be fermented into wine. Drinking fresh fruit juice would have been refreshing and provided natural sugars for energy. However, fresh juice doesn't keep well without refrigeration, so it would only be available in season or immediately after preparation. Dried dates could be soaked in water to make a simple sweet drink. These fruit-based drinks were likely more common for the elite or as occasional treats for others. Milk was another liquid we discussed. As mentioned, while available from cows, goats and sheep, its perishability and potential for lactose intolerance might have limited its widespread consumption by adults at breakfast, making it more common for children or the wealthy. It's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit that Egyptians sometimes made non-alcoholic or very low-alcoholic fermented drinks from fruits or other plants besides grain. These would have offered different flavours and a different kind of refreshment than beer. The existence and prevalence of these alternative fermented beverages beyond traditional beer is still an area of scholarly discussion. So, what did you drink with your ancient Egyptian breakfast besides beer? Primarily water, with all its potential risks. Occasionally, if you were lucky or wealthy, perhaps some fresh fruit juice or milk. But beer was the dependable, calorie-rich, relatively safe liquid that accompanied the bread as the essential morning beverage for most. It wasn't about having a variety of options like a modern coffee shop menu. It was about having a safe, nourishing drink that provided energy. Imagine the feeling of that thick beer going down, providing not just hydration but also sustenance. Or the taste of plain Nile water, hoping it was clean today. Or perhaps the rare treat of a sweet sip of date juice. Each liquid choice tells a story about your status, the season, and the risks you were willing to take. Beer was the pragmatic choice, the fusion of necessity and available technology, providing both drink and food value in one vessel. It underscores again how resourceful and practical the ancient Egyptians were, turning grain into the two most fundamental elements of their diet: solid food, bread, and liquid food, safe drink, beer. Thirsty work, this history stuff, isn't it? Makes you appreciate your tap water, or that morning coffee, just a little bit more. Okay, we've journeyed through the ancient Egyptian morning, from the first light by the Nile to the last bite of gritty bread and sip of thick beer. We've seen the staples that fueled a civilization, the simple tools they used, where and when they ate, and even some of the surprising extras that might occasionally appear. Now let's take a moment to digest it all, to reflect on how this ancient breakfast compares to what you might eat today. Thinking about it, there are some similarities, aren't there? Like us, the ancient Egyptians needed that first meal to break the fast after sleeping and to get energy for the day. They relied on carbohydrates for fuel, just like many of us eat toast, cereal or pastries, and they had drinks to go with their food, though their primary choice was quite different from our coffee, tea or juice. The basic human need for morning sustenance is universal across time and cultures, but the differences are perhaps even more striking. Imagine your breakfast table today. You likely have a wide variety of foods to choose from, sourced from all over the world. Soft, refined bread or pastries, a huge selection of cereals, eggs, bacon, yogurt, fruit from different continents, coffee beans from far-off lands. Your ancient Egyptian self had a diet focused intensely on what could be grown locally, mainly barley and emmer wheat, transformed into dense bread and thick beer. The variety was minimal for most people, the reliance on grain almost total. The texture of the food was different too. That constant presence of grit in the bread from stone milling is a huge contrast to our finely processed flours. Imagine that sensation every morning, and the beer, thick, cloudy, yeasty, nothing like the clear, often fizzy drinks we consume. The sheer amount of labour involved in getting that breakfast to the table was also vastly different. No supermarket shelves stocked with ready-to-eat options. Every grain had to be grown, harvested, threshed, winnowed, ground by hand, mixed and baked using basic fire or simple ovens. Every batch of beer required processing grain and fermentation. It was a constant cycle of manual work just to produce the basic necessities. Your modern breakfast likely involved a quick trip to the store and maybe a few minutes with a toaster or a bowl. The social aspect was tied to necessity and work. Eating with your fellow labourers as part of your daily ration, or grabbing food quickly before heading to the fields. Compare that to a modern family breakfast at a table, or grabbing a quick bite during a commute, or even skipping breakfast altogether, something perhaps less feasible when your daily survival depended on physical labour, fueled by that morning meal. We also saw how stark the difference in diet was between the rich and the poor. While today wealth certainly influences diet, the basic staples like soft bread and clean water are accessible to most in many parts of the world. In ancient Egypt, the difference wasn't just quantity, but the very quality and type of food available, from gritty bread and basic beer for the masses to fine enriched bread, possibly meat, and varied fruits and dairy for the elite. Reflecting on the quirky details, drinking beer through a straw, possibly gnawing on dried fish, eating bread that wore down your teeth, these add colour and a sense of the very different reality of life back then. These weren't just historical facts, they were part of the daily experience. And it's interesting to remember that even with all we've learned from archaeology, texts and tomb paintings, there are still things historians and experts debate, like the exact timing of meals, the commonality of certain foods like eggs or vegetables at breakfast, or the prevalence of water purification methods. History isn't always neatly packaged. There are still mysteries, little corners of daily life we're still trying to fully understand. Ultimately, the ancient Egyptian breakfast was a meal built on necessity, efficiency, and the abundant yet challenging resources provided by the Nile Valley. It was the essential starting point for a demanding day, a practical fueling strategy honed over thousands of years. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't varied for most, and it certainly wasn't quick or easy to prepare compared to today. But it worked. It powered the people who built one of the most incredible civilizations the world has ever seen. That simple meal of bread and beer, eaten as the sun rose over the sands, was the quiet, powerful engine of ancient Egypt. As you settle down now, letting these images of ancient mornings fade, the smell of baking bread, the gentle lapping of the Nile, the feel of that rough, warm loaf in your hand, the taste of the earthy, thick beer, the distant sound of morning activity beginning, the sun climbing slowly, the work waiting. Feel yourself drift, letting the sounds of ancient Egypt become quiet. The river flows on, the sun continues its journey, the grain grows, is harvested, becomes bread, becomes beer. The cycle continues, a timeless rhythm, your own breath slowing, becoming steady, peaceful, letting go of the day, letting the past fade into dreams, finding that calm, quiet place.